for the welcome everybody. I am Rita Olla from the University of Nevada, Reno. I am a doctoral student in the behavioral analysis program, and today I'm honored to be a part of the Q crew to introduce Dr. Susan Ramlo as one of our monthly Q speakers. Dr. Ramlo will present her chapter 7, A Science of Subjectivity, from the book Cultivating Q Methodology, essay honorary Stephen Brown, that she's also edited with Dr. Rodas and Dr. Thomas. Let me give you some notes about Dr. Ramlo. So Dr. Ramlo is a recognized international expert in Q methodology and mixed method research. She has held various leadership positions within the International Society for the Scientific Study of Subjectivity. Her YouTube channel, ZQ, is dedicated to assisting researchers interested in the Q methodology. Dr. Ramlo is also the owner of a research consulting firm, ZQ. She is in her 20th year as a junior professor at the University of Akron, and prior to academia, she spent 7 years as an industrial physicist. And with that said, I don't want to take more time to Dr. Ramlo. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that she can share her presentation, and we are ready to listen to her.
All right. Welcome to chapter 7. Oh, it's got like all kinds of things up here. All right. It's reminding me that you can see my screen. That's exciting. All right. So I'm here to talk about chapter 7, which I entitled The Science of Subjectivity. In part, this was the topic I selected for the Cultivating Q Methodology book, because it seems like whenever Steve Brown and I get together over coffee or breakfast or lunch, we end up talking about Q and subjectivity and physics. So this seemed like a fitting topic for this text. Oops. All right, I have to just figure out why. There we go. All right, so although Q methodologists often proclaim that Q methodology offers a scientific way to study subjectivity, the use of the word scientific can be lost on those both inside and outside of the Q community. I'll say that it's often lost in other contexts as well. So this chapter focuses on the subjective character of science and its implications for understanding Q methodology as a scientific means of studying subjectivity. And I wasn't really sure who all would be here. I've advertised this kind of broadly, as have others. So I thought maybe I'd start off with a little bit of an introduction related to Q methodology. So the Q sort is what people most often associate with Q methodology, where participants take statements and of the Q sample and sort them from most agree, or most like my view, or most something, to most disagree or most unlike my view. So this is just a screenshot from one of my previous studies. I think it's, this is how faculty what they thought about emergency remote instruction during the COVID pandemic when we all had to move online. And just as a kind of very brief overview of Q, right? We always begin with concourse, which is a collection of items, typically statements related to the topic. Then we select a subset of that concourse, which we call the Q sample. The number of items in the Q sample is actually the sample size. That's why it's Q sample. The P set is the selection of participants in the study, which is most often relatively small, especially compared to large quantitative studies, which use factor analysis and other statistics, which sometimes throws people off. The Q sort is our data collection method, where participants sort those items into the grid like I showed you. based on a condition of instruction. So for instance, in the previous slide, faculty were asked to consider their move of their face-to-face classes online at the beginning of the pandemic, and then to sort those statements based upon their view of that experience. There are analyses, correlation, and factor analysis, which again kind of makes people want us to have much larger numbers of people participating than are necessary. And then, of course, we interpret the different factors. I usually say 2 to 4 different factors. Each factor represents a unique viewpoint. We use the composite or theoretical sort for each factor and post-sort comments in order to describe the views in a holistic way. So we look at kind of the broad snapshot of those things opposed to focusing on only 1 or 2 statements. So let's start off with talking about objectivity and subjectivity. Subjectivity relates to viewpoints, perspectives, opinions, judgments, or personal preferences, and therefore it's not a factual matter. One of the things that often gives quantitative researchers some confusion is they want us to validate the statements, for instance, but there's no way to validate somebody's personal viewpoint because it's internal to them. Scientific objectivity relates to removing personal bias, value commitments, personal interest from claims, methods, and results of science. And I will just say it's a little bit of a pipe dream that science is subjectivity free. Oftentimes and inappropriately, quantification is considered equivalent to scientific objectivity. In other words, if one can put numbers to it, it must be objective. That's certainly not necessarily true. And philosophers of science have determined that several conceptions of the ideal of objectivity in science are either questionable or unattainable. And objective claims are both basically those considered factual, and we can do falsification. So we can show whether they're true or false. So here's where I start talking about feeling in science. So the first is a wonderful book, which Steve Brown introduced to me. And I think I've actually read it at least twice now. It's Evelyn Fox Keller's text on Barbara McClintock, who was a maze researcher in Cold Spring Harbor in the US. And one of the reasons she was so amazing in detailing certain aspects of corn, which is maize, was because she literally had a feeling for the organism. She was so enveloped in these corn plants that she kind of had a feel for it. If you've ever read the book Blink by Malcolm, not McDowell. Anyway, it's that kind of thing. Then that leads me to talk about my own experience when I was an industrial physicist. We used to always talk about the black art of crystal growth. So right here, this is me unloading my little test furnace full of cesium iodide pure, which was used in Fermilab's KTEV experiment. Pat myself on the back. Here's what an encased sodium iodide detector looked like. Here, this is me in a picture we used in an advertisement for what was Harshaw Chemical. I'm the only person standing in case you haven't met me. I am a little on the short side, but we always called it the black art of crystal growth because it's basically chemistry. We melt powders, you slowly cool them. We have thermocouples. We did statistical process control. And the idea was to grow a single crystal. They were 14 inches in diameter, 16 inches or in diameter, or 24 inches in diameter. So they were quite big, but it kind of comes back to that feeling for the organism. So that's why we always called it the black art of crystal growth, because you had to have a feel for looking at the data in your graphs for statistical process control and understanding if you should tweak the temperature one way or another, or maybe slow the elevator that slowly would move this crucible of platinum through this network of heaters. So I like to use that example as how science is not just objective. There's still that feeling for the organism that is part of science. So here's where I diverge again. So kind of comparing two types of physics. So first is classical physics. So if you took physics in high school or as an undergraduate, you learn things like F equals ma. You might have seen these equations for projectile motion. You may have seen pictures such as this, where we have a projectile without any air resistance moving through a system where only the velocity, right, in the y direction changes and the velocity in the x direction stays constant, right? These equations and these ideas, concepts are all based on, right, objects. And we know that all objects obey, in at least the macro world, identify and behave just like we have these equations. So we know what's going to happen. It doesn't matter if our projectile here looks like a football. I can change it to a calculator. I can change it to a rock. It doesn't matter. All the rules apply exactly the same. Quantum physics isn't so clear cut. It's based on probability functions, which the short answer is it cannot be falsified. Trying to make measurements affects the measurements, unlike Newtonian physics, and it does not allow for deterministic interpretation. So that just really means that everything's a little squishy. And see, there's my little be a quantum mechanic picture. All right, science in Q methodology is kind of everywhere. First of all, Q is exploratory. We use abduction in the factor analytic stage. That's that feel for the organism again. Stevenson explained that the Q sample is the independent variable. Conditions of the experiment are the conditions of instructions provided to the participants, and that's what they use to, right, consider all of the statements in the Q sample while they provide to us their own internal subjective view. The Q sorts are then factor analyzed, but not just factor analyzed, right? But factor analyzed in a way that they obey Niels Bohr's principle of complementarity, meaning that unlike normative tests, where we're looking for an overall, like what's the norm, right? So if you took advanced statistics, you may have learned about cutting out outliers, right? Because we're only interested in this normative view. Not in Q. Here, we understand that even though a group of people, right, may have had the same experienced the same psychological event or was in the same classroom, their view of that experience is not the same. So different people will have different views of that experience. And then Stevenson again explained that the factor structure provides states of feeling and that these factors have been quantumized. Quantumized here, not meaning quantized, but quantumized meaning, right, put into the same realm as we would looking at particles in quantum physics. So subjectivity and science, to conjoin science and subjectivity must seem to most a misnomer. The fundamental difference between objective and subjective, however, is merely a matter of self-reference. And William Stevenson wrote that in the preface to Steve Brown's political subjectivity text. And I think that this is something that we need to be more cognizant of, that the self-reference within the Q sort makes Q methodology so different from other types of data collection. Paul Dirac, very famous physicist, once explained that the aim of science is to make difficult things understandable in a simpler way. Here, he is not talking about reductionism, which is really the goal of our methodology, but he's talking about modeling science mathematically and conceptually about patterns, and it's about structure, much like when we factor analyze our Q sorts, right? What we're seeking is operant structure. And it's that same idea. We're trying to make this system, right? This difficult thing to understand, people's subjectivity, more understandable. But of course, there's many faulty assumptions about Q and about Q based on faulty views of science. Campen and Tomas and Campen are pretty good examples of that. They kind of summon the gods of science in their quality and quantity articles to declare Q methodology just basically unsound, and that it is not based upon scientific principles. And then they provide their very objective centric view of what science is, along with a lot of misconceptions about Q. I'm not saying that we all need to go out and learn physics, although it'd be good for you, but right, we need to understand more about the science of subjectivity and of Q methodology. One of my favorite articles in the Chronicle of Higher Ed was published in January 2018. It's called The Tyranny of Metrics, the quest to quantify everything undermines higher education, which is actually also based on the book by Jerry Muller called The Tyranny of Metrics, which I recommend. So in summary of this great article, it's about how more and more in higher education, but elsewhere, right, administrators, everybody, right, wants to replace judgment with numbers. So if we can stick numbers to it, then it must be objective. It must be right, right? And then we don't have to weigh in on things because the numbers will just tell us what to do. And this, of course, is a big problem in social science behavioral research in general, not just in higher education. And of course, there's a great quote in this article as well as the book, which is not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. And I think that in part, this is symbolic of people doing Q studies, especially early on. They want to rely on numbers that are given to us in the analyses, right? Variance accounted for, eigenvalue cutoffs. But just because they're numbers doesn't mean they're important to, right, our analyses. And I think that's something that's very important to remember. It also reminds us that judgmental rotation accepts and emphasizes the role of the researcher in the factor analytic process rather than basing such decisions on pure mathematics, right? And that we have to recognize and communicate that this is a strength within Q, not a weakness. And this is where we use abductive thinking, right? What we know, what we've gotten from, right? Getting a feel for the Q sorts, what people have written in their post-sort questionnaire or have said in their post-sort interviews. So here we have, I got to figure out how to make this little thing go up. Nope, yep. Oh, of course, now it does that. All right, so in reality, right, the factor, when we're looking at factor solutions, we're looking at different solutions in the framework of scientific exploration. So the reality is that R factor analysis, which is grouping items, like we have my little picture here, grouping items, there's actually a lot more subjectivity going on in R factor analysis than most quantitative people would feel comfortable admitting. But we're not going to talk about them. We're going to talk about R factor analysis, R factor solutions within Q. So the first thing that we have to recognize is that there isn't just one perfect mathematical solution. That's not what we're seeking. We're not looking for simple structure like an R factor in R factor analysis. Instead, we're exploring different numbers of factors extracted, different factor extraction choices, centroid versus PCA, rotation choices, theoretical versus Varimax. Every study I do, I don't even know, I probably do 4 or 5 different factor solutions looking at the output, the subjectivity that emerges in seeking operant subjectivity. So a structure that makes sense, that melds with what, right, I felt I learned and got a feeling for by looking at the Q sorts, by reading or listening to post-sort comments. And so that's one of the things I think is the most difficult for especially new Q methodologists to embrace, is that we're seeking an operant structure, right? Not just simple structure. So not just the structure that's easiest to interpret, although I will freely admit that recently I have given advice to newer Q methodologists to just do PCA and Varimax for their first Q study, just because there's so much going on that you have to kind of start somewhere. I will admit that my first Q study, probably the first 2, I used PCA and Varimax. It's not a sin, right? But I do think that we should all explore multiple solutions. So what's important when we do our Q analyses? Exploration and scientific inquiry are really important. When we flag sorts on factors, we shouldn't put all of our trust in the auto flagging algorithm, whether it's PQ method or CADE or KenQ or any of the different softwares out there for analyzing Q sorts. Need to go through that list and make sure that each sort that's flagged is a clear representative of a factor, right? And the auto flagging, it's not perfect. And we need to remember that we're seeking operant structure. So I recommend examining the descriptive tables. I like CADE, KenQ, because it gives you those composite Q sorts. So it gives you a nice snapshot, just like looking at an individual's Q sort. You can look at that output and get, I think, a really good feel for each of the factors each time you explore different factor solutions. Things that are unimportant in Q analyses: simple structure, so forcing, right? So PCA and Varimax, the goal mathematically or statistically is to minimize loadings on some factors and maximize them on others. Things like eigenvalue cutoffs, right? If you've taken statistics, right, and you've used SPSS, right, the default eigenvalue cutoff is 1. It's really subjective. That's also not cut in stone for R. All of our analyses give us variance accounted for, also not particularly important. It's really more associated with the number of sorters that are identified on a factor that accounts for variance. That's a variance accounted for, but the number of people on a factor doesn't indicate its strength, right? What we're looking for, right, going back to the flagging, is trying to best define a viewpoint via factor. And having a large number of participants, although, right, reviewers who are unfamiliar with Q or have done, you know, that one Q study, so now they know all about Q. They want to know why you only have 24 participants. And again, I like to count or talk about Muller. Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. So let's talk about student evaluation of teaching. This is really how somebody brought Q methodology to my attention, because I was always talking about how student evaluation of teaching didn't really make sense to me, because I knew that every student in my classroom was not having the same experience. They did not have the same view of me as an instructor. They did not have the same view of the learning experience I was trying to offer them, right? And yet that's one of the problems with student evaluation of teaching, is that we take, right, the average of all the Likert scale rating students offer, and then we take the mean, which is wrong in a number of ways, and we say, this is students' view of you, or students' view of the book, or any multitude of aspects related to the book. So my question is, if all students had the exact same experience, would they all have the same grade? Wouldn't they all have learned the same amount of material? Wouldn't the standard deviation of the student evaluation of teaching instrument always be 0 because everybody scored you exactly the same on each item? We know that's not true. And of course, there's many, many, many problems about student evaluation of teaching and Likert scale surveys in general. So why not borrow from Steve Brown's Political Subjectivity? Because I think this really says it all. When a subject responds to a scale item, like Likert scale 1 to 5, therefore the meaning and significance of his response has for him may differ in major aspects from the meaning assumed by the observer or anyone else. And to ignore this possibility is to be unwilling to accept what is before one's eyes, to be aspect blind, and to prefer the artificial to the natural. Language in use is by its nature symbolic and self-referential, with each combination of words being capable of carrying a wide range of meanings. For an investigator to regard his own understanding as in some sense objective or correct is therefore pretentious in the extreme. And I could not agree more. So in other words, right, on a Likert scale question, what I think is a 3 might not be a 3 to you. It could be a 4 to you. It could be a 2 to you. It could be a 5 to you. And what does it mean, right? Likert scale surveys often have, which I'll get to it towards the end, right? They have definitions of terms, but the participant is pretty much unaware of those definitions. And even if they weren't cognizant of those definitions, chances are they'd ignore them. So getting back to our student evaluation of teaching, right? There's all kinds of problems, right? It's a Likert scale. Those are ordinal, not continuous variables, means that using the mean is wrong, right? It's what we learned in statistics 101 or should have, right? Because the mean is the central tendency, right? So we're finding the mean of ordinal data that is verboten, right? Student evaluation of teaching are unlikely to be Gaussian. So if you plot them, right, they are usually more likely to be bimodal or even trimodal, representing probable differing views. And the analyses of SET data are based on assumptions of equal variances and tests for homogeneity, yet neither equal variance nor homogeneity are likely to be true for student evaluation of teaching data. And this is where I often talk about not student evaluation of teaching, but faculty evaluation of a department chair. a number of years ago, we had a number of evaluation tools, including faculty submitting written comments. And there was a Likert scale, just overall rating the chair's performance from a low, a 1, to a high of 7. And when this data was offered to the department faculty, we were shown that the chair was rated about 3.5 or thereabouts. So right in the middle. But yet when we read the qualitative comments, this didn't seem like they really made sense combined with this 3.5 out of 7 rating. So I asked the chair of the committee if she could plot the numerical rankings offered. And it was literally 1s and 2s and 6s and 7s. So there was pretty obviously not a singular view about this person as a department chair. And of course, it's very possible that, for instance, those who liked him and gave him 6s and 7s may have liked him for different reasons. But we couldn't ascertain that simply from this Likert scale rating. And I think that that's what is often lost. And even though, right, Likert scale surveys far more popular than Q methodology. And some more questions pertaining to the validity and reliability of SET instruments go back decades, right? All the way back to my favorite article by Vanderpool from 1959, asking basically if student evaluation of teaching was meaningful or just a sacred cow. Rantanen found inter-rater reliability on SETs examined to be very low. Others have also determined low reliability estimates as well as poor validity related to SET instruments. And instructors basically try to tweak these metrics, right, by doing things like being lenient graders, reducing, right, the quality of their assessments or their teaching, or a multitude of other things, bringing in food, right, telling students that they give everybody A's, all of these things. Basically, even if a SET instrument was found somehow to be valid and reliable, this would invalidate that instrument, any of them. And then finally, student evaluation of teaching are inherently biased against race, gender, perceived difficulty of the course, the grade received, right? And in the end, they're supposed to measure quality of teaching, and they don't. They're probably better at measuring bias and these bulleted items than quality of instruction or quality of learning. But Q allows us to include that bias to help us tell the real story of, right, what's going on in a student evaluation of teaching situation, because we can look at specifics related to the topics and teaching, right? And there's so much more we can do. We can tease out some of these ideas of the course was very difficult, the instructor was boring, right? All of those kinds of things. And best of all, we don't have those issues of validity and reliability within Q, right? That's one of the reasons why we have post-tort interviews, right? So that we can better understand the participants' understanding or, right, validity, how they perceive those statements. And again, there's no way for us to validate somebody's internal viewpoint. So validity and reliability, they're just not issues in Q. Because, and of course, Q assumes non-singular viewpoints exist via complementarity. That also allows us to see more, right, about what's happening maybe in a course or within a program or a variety of other ways of assessing. These happen to be a couple of my articles where the studies were basically student evaluation of teaching. They didn't use student evaluation of teaching questions, although that was an early study I did way back in 2004, almost 20 years ago. So students' views about flipping a physics course, right, in determining multiple perspectives in a course for future math educators. So basically doing, right, a needs assessment, what they thought would be more useful to them, and then evaluating an inquiry-based bioinformatics course using Q methodology. I was not teaching that course, just so that's clear. I don't know really much about bioinformatics. And then kind of coming, well, pseudo full circle. So I was recently interviewed for an article about STEM education, and one of the prompts was something to the effect of, something like 19% of students who major in STEM end up working in STEM. And that was from the US Census, the most recent US Census. And that just didn't make sense to me. I mean, I've had thousands of students that have come through the programs I've taught in, and that just didn't seem right. So I looked up the census, and here's part of this. Here's the graphic, which helps explain this whole thing. So STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. That's what the acronym usually is for. So here we have math and statistics. We have engineering. Notice that engineers, right, pretty much end up working as engineers. Maybe they work in computers. We have physical science like chemistry and physics, right? And they end up over here. And here's biology. Of course, a lot of biology, they end up in healthcare. They end up as doctors because they're biology majors, because they want to go to medical school or vet school. And here's the really interesting part for me. We have psychology and social sciences in here, which I thought was very interesting, because if you asked somebody at my university or your university if psychology and social sciences fit into the STEM framework as we currently understand it, they'd say no. And here's a shock. A lot of people in psychology and social science end up doing social services or healthcare, right? Or service. And so here we're kind of going back to the beginning of Stevenson's objection of psychology framing itself on Newtonian physics, right? The idea that we could measure things that we can't see, right? We can't see, right, cognitive ability. We have tests that are supposed to measure them. But is that the kind of science that we think of when we say STEM? I'm thinking no. But anyway, my response to the person who interviewed me was, well, in surveys such as these, right, how you define your terms, in this case STEM, matters. Right? And this is really kind of an interesting way of, I think, closing this talk, along with my Devo quote that has connections to both Kent State and the University of Akron, which is a song called Gates of Steel. And here is the quote from that song. Take it, I won't sing it because you don't want me to. Take a chance, a brand new dance. Twist away the gates of steel. A man is real, not made of steel. And I think that's what we need to be cognizant of when we get reviewer feedback, right? Where they want us to have thousands of participants or whatever, right, metric they think is missing from our methodology. All right, and that's it. And I'm ready to take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ramlo. Extremely interesting conversation about what we should mean by science, what can be counted and not can be counted, but is relevant. I really enjoy those points. So I think it's a time now for anyone to ask a question to Dr. Ramlo. and you can raise your hands or you can type in the chat box. And I will, with the help of Miku, to help these questions.
I'm looking at the chat, so I'll just how about if I just dive in? All right. Let's see, where are we? Yes, Malcolm Gladwell. Thank you, Miku. Yes, I love the book Blink too. All right. Brett has asked, time permitting, would you mind defining the term operant? All right, I will do my best to define. The term operant really means natural, so representing the actual subjectivity. So not, I'll use some terms that may or may not be exactly right. Steve Brown can correct me, which is, right, we're not trying to force fit people into boxes, right? Where, right, so we're not trying to, I don't know, group all the women together and all the men together, or, right, look for simple structure. We want to find that factor analytic solution that makes sense, that best represents what actually the views are, right? So when we factor analyze, the Q sorts never, their position relative to each other, that never changes. But we want to find the best way to, right, represent what is naturally occurring. Hope that made sense. Anybody want to chime in and correct me?
We have Joanna Stamber that she raised her hands for a question.
Okay. Hi, Joanna. You have your hand up. Do you have a question? No?
You are muted.
Oh,
you are muted.
I am muted.
No,
Oh, no,
Joanna,
you're muted. Yeah. We can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. I had it on, people can't unmute. I'm so sorry. All right. There you go. Sorry, Joanna.
I don't know why I suddenly thought, Miku, that you could read lips, but that's okay. Thank you. Sue, wonderful. Thank you. You have my head spinning a bit. I can ask you questions on Mondays, so I'll just kind of ask actually the broader question I think that was raised for me, which is, for me, the strength of Q, and I've said this many times, is the kind of critical theory way of being able to find the researcher in the study, look at those biases, surface them, understand the other ideologies that might be present in a study. And I'm curious, I'm thinking of Sandra Harding. I don't know if you're familiar with Sandra Harding's work. She's written several books connecting the natural sciences and feminist studies, and has a lot of really great insights. Standpoint theory is one that she's largely known for, but one of her arguments over the years has been that the sciences accepted in modernity are going to have to change. They're going to have to shift to accept the viewpoints of those not in Western thought, and to find ways to incorporate them. And so I'm wondering, in all of your years of having been in Q, especially as a woman in science, if you sense there being a shift to different perceptions, or maybe more openness to Q as subjectivity, as we hopefully try and open ourselves more in terms of the natural sciences to understanding that we have biases, that Western scientific thought has embedded principles, not just positivism, but many others that might, hurt the way that we go about our research. So I would love to hear your thoughts.
I think biases are very difficult to overcome, and most people aren't even cognizant of their own biases. It's actually, I'm in the throes of actually collecting concourse right now for a study about retention of engineering students as undergrads, and the idea of accepting people who are different is one of the commonalities that I've seen in students' responses to my very open-ended survey, which basically asks two questions, which is what would retain you in an engineering degree, and what would persuade you to change your major. And a number of students have written things like, I don't feel like I fit in because I don't look like the other people in my classes. And I think that, at least in my readings in general, faculty in STEM really aren't very cognizant of those kinds of things. It just doesn't, I mean, like one of the things in the book talking about leaving, why students leave the sciences, by Seymour and Hewitt, great book. And then the newer version, which is just Seymour and a number of other authors authoring chapters. But here's a surprise, like in engineering, most faculty are men, and they're usually curve, and there's competition within the classroom to have the highest score, right? Because there's a lot of curving. Yet in their, and the first book talking about leaving was very qualitative. It's all qualitative, actually. And one of the things that really came out was that female students really hated the idea of a competitive classroom. They didn't like it. It was a big reason why students changed their majors to something else. But faculty still curve. I mean, that book came out in 1997. Faculty still curve. They don't, like, if you talk to mostly, I mean, I think there's one other, now in mechanical engineering, don't ask, but there's one other woman, and I think there's something like 25 or 30 full-time faculty. So people curve, they don't understand why that would be a bad thing. And it's what they experienced. So in that way, I think the bias just kind of folds into itself. So I think there's a long road. I kind of have a long-winded answer to your question, Joanna. I think there's a long road to getting rid of bias in all research, no matter what kind of research it is.
We have a Clark who have raised their hands for a question. Clark, you would like to go on?
Yeah, my question is, I guess I'm looking for a metaphor for why Q measures the way it does. Now, just a bit of background. I'm a physics professor who's also a psychologist, so I'm a weird perspective, not a common one. And so, in physics, we have the luxury of laws that are, very precise and predictive. And in psychology, we don't have anything that robust. That doesn't mean it's not good or worth it, but it is different. And so for me, with my feet in two worlds, I need for a fundamentally different kind of measurement when you're dealing with subjectivity. And so is why measure the Q way? Is it, there's a reason I don't use a meter stick to measure the width of an atom. I mean, can you say something about, why we measure the way we measure and why that's right and good? Because I think it is, but I'm on the hunt for a better metaphor.
Okay. I don't know if I can give you a metaphor, but I think that the difference in Q is how we perceive data collection, that because we're measuring something internal to a person, we're allowing them to look inside themselves and present to us, right, in the form of their Q sort, their viewpoint. And I think that usually people who participate in a Q study in general are far more reflective when they're performing a Q study than when they're doing, say, a Likert scale survey. So I'll go back to 2004 when I did I guess technically my second Q study, which never got published, but we had students in a basic chemistry and undergrad class that was just a general education science requirement. And we had students complete the college's bubble Likert scale survey, student evaluation of teaching. And then we had them do a Q sort. And I remember this one student, I can still picture her. She was very anxious, she was very agitated. So I walked over to her and I said, you know, is there something wrong? She's like, I don't like this sorting business. It takes too long. I have to think too much about the statements. And I was like, oh, well, like, how is that different from doing, you know, the usual evaluation of teachers? Oh, because that's easy. I go, oh, Dr. Johnson, I like her. On a scale of 1 to 5, I think she's a 4. And then I go bubble, 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 and I hand it in, and it takes me like 2 minutes. And I like that better because I don't have to think. So I think, first of all, Q sorts make people think. And I have other examples that are far more endearing about participants being very reflective and maybe having some kind of personal revelation during the Q sort. But I think the other part of Q is that we don't assume a single viewpoint. And so we let multiple voices be heard. My very first Q study that I did that had to do with trying to develop a school of technology at my university, which never happened, by the way. You know, administrators changed and then out the window. But I ended up doing a Q study. There were 2 people who were very vocal. Ended up, they were on the same factor. It was bipolar. One of them was on one end, one of them was, and then everybody else was on 2 different factors. And so we went through and we talked about consensus and some other things. And then I asked for feedback on this process of trying to move through, right, developing this school of technology. And one of my favorite comments, which I actually had multiple people write this, which was, this was a very democratic process. I felt like my voice was actually heard. You know, and then there was somebody else who said, you know, they never speak up in meetings, they're kind of an introvert, but this way allowed their view to be expressed. And it was so meaningful to them. And I think that that's one of the biggest difference between Q and other types of study where we're looking at something that's subjective. Because it is democratic. We're putting different voices on equal footing, right? And we're letting all those voices be heard instead of just the 2 guys who are the loudest. Did I answer your question, Clark?
I think so. I think, you know, Likert scales are for human behavior makes about as much sense as an average zip code.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes.
you lose a distinct, well, every average drops some distinctions, and you can only go so far with that and be meaningful still. So, all right. Yes, thank you. I do appreciate the answer.
Dr. Ramlo, there is 2 questions in the chat box, pretty elaborate if you want to have a look.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Where am I? Oh,
at the end.
At the end here.
Yes.
Oh, the 2 questions, I found it. All right. So this is, I'm not gonna be able to say Minowa's name right.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Close? Masatoshi?
Yes. First
Minowa.
question is the basic one. In terms of the scientific analysis, it is important to determine the number of factors. Factor analysis. It is. I think it's very difficult. I always
Yes.
have a hard time in deciding. I'm struggling about it, and how to explain it. And many literature says vaguely and a lot of things. So how do you think about it? Do you have any tips or hints to determine number of factors is first question. And the second one is mixed analysis as a Q survey. As when you of the Q survey, after the survey of after the Q sort and Q analysis, there is a way of the R Likert scale survey for example, in online and large number of sample. How do you think about the effect or findings about such kind of Q survey? That is my question. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, well, first of all, I think that, yeah, when determining the number of factors, I think that, I'm kind of going back to the book Blink, I think that the more studies you do, the better feel you get for that. But my suggestion is always try multiple factor solutions, right? I mean, in CADE, it gives you a scree plot, but I can't tell you that the scree plot is going to exactly tell you how many factors you should extract. It could give you a suggestion, but usually, I guess I would say that it's usually between 2 and 4. I usually try multiple solutions. I don't save every Excel file and composite Q sort from a factor. As I go through that, I don't even know how long. I just kind of get lost in the data and the solutions, and I just save a whole bunch of versions until I find one that seems the most satisfactory, that really gets to what people were trying to share via their Q sorts and their written comments or interviews. And so, yeah, it's vague. It's vague, but I think that usually when I'm writing up a Q study for publication, I might say I explored multiple solutions, and this one was the most operant. If it's a methodology type of journal, I might detail more about what I did. If it's an application, so I'm, trying to get something published about how students felt about me flipping a physics classroom, then I'm probably not going to really describe the analyses at all. I'll just say that the sorts were analyzed, and statistically sorts were grouped together in order, to let us interpret the different viewpoints, and I'd probably leave it at that. I think the more, especially if a journal hasn't published a Q study before, the more you talk about factor analysis and correlation, the more likely you are to have the editor send your paper to a very quantitative researcher who will then freak out and tell you many things that are wrong with your paper that aren't wrong necessarily. So, and then I can't say, I don't know enough about the idea per se of taking Q studies and then turning them into Likert scale surveys. I think it's the difference between counting noses, which is really why you would do it as a survey. You want to know what the distribution of, factor 1 type people are in a population, and what the distribution is of factor 2 in that same population. I guess my short answer is I don't care. I don't care how many people have that view. I'm more interested in the views themselves, and examining. So for instance, I did a study about speech on campus, free speech on college campuses in the US. I don't need to know how many people of each view there are in my college or in the US university and college population. I was more interested in the types of views, because that told me, that answered my question And I guess I'm not much of a nose counter.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you.
We're kind of get to the 1 hour time. So if anyone needs to leave, don't feel bad. If someone will still want to ask questions, if Dr. Ramlo is available a little bit more, we are going to be very happy to stay here a little bit more. So it's depend on us deciding to ask more questions or just leave.
I'm
And
happy to stick around for a
okay.
while and answer anybody's questions. So
Thank
And
you,
real-
Dr. Ramla. Yeah.
Real quick, Sue, Sharon was asking, but also I usually try to ask this. Will you be able to provide your PowerPoint to those that attended today? You can send that
sure.
out to them. Okay, so if you do have to go now, no worries. You'll get a recording of these final last few question or Q&A, and then also the PowerPoint as well. So I'll hand it back to you, Sue and Rita.
Thank you, Miku, for this support and reminders. Actually, I have a little question for you, Dr. Ramlo, and maybe it could be a kind of my heritage that it's a little bit quantitative, but I start to really appreciate this sophistication that the Q methodology allow us to do. And I really like your beginning of introduction when you said, well, not everyone that counts can be counted. And economics kind of addressed this issue years ago when they have the problem to measure the ability of a population to be innovative. They use some type of a quantitative measure, but in the end, no one was happy with that. The advantage is that based on these models, quantitative models, as all of us know, often public policy are organized. Like, for example, if the inflation goes up, the interest rate of the Fed goes up. So a lot of decisions are grounded on numbers. So my question in relation to what you said is the following. Do you know about any study that come out with different solutions? As you also said that when you dig into the Q sorts, you want to analyze different type of solution that makes sense. Have you ever been in the situation to have different solutions that could make sense? So you kind of, well, which one I should take? And on which you decide, what was your parameter to decide? So this is the first part of the question. Then if you ever had the solutions that could have a different implication in policy, namely, if I identify this a certain type of solution, I should do this in the community, in schools, whatever. If I adopt another solution, I should do something different. So how you would manage these nuances in subjectivities?
That's a great
And so
question. Well, I'll kind of go back to another chapter in the book, which is Bob Braswell's solutions, where he takes the same set of Q sorts and analyzes them a whole bunch of different ways, and the solutions really aren't drastically different. And so I can't say that I've ever ended up with something that one solution was vastly different than the other. It's usually more like a microscope where, you know, one solution, you know, I can see it, but it's just not as clear, right? So then I go through and I might try a different solution. Oh, this is clearer. I can really see, right, kind of that feeling again. So, I mean, I guess like asking how I pick my final solution is pretty subjective, but I'm using, right, abductive reasoning. I literally kind of try to engulf myself in what people said after their sorts to get a general feeling for what different types of views are there. And then the factor analysis of the Q sorts just kind of helps some of that come into focus. And I'm not saying that if I think there's, you know, 2 views going into the analyses and then I find out, oh no, there's definitely 3 views. I don't disregard that solution. It's hard to explain. I mean, I really think it is kind of like Blink in that you just, the more studies you do, the better feel you get. So that's kind of why I like that idea of like the, you know, the black art of crystal growth. After a while, you just get a sense of things, and it's really hard to explain. And it's like Minoa said, you know, everything seems so vague. Like, how do you write that up? And my answer is I usually don't write that up. Just because, right, this is the solution that made the most sense. It best represents, right, the operant structure. It brought everything into focus, and I could see how this solution makes sense. That, right, what people said after the sort come through in this factor solution. Did I answer your question, Reed? I hope so.
Yes. I really like this aspect of Q methodology. I am also, I have to admit, a little bit obsessed of coming to identify policies related with different opinions, group of people that I can identify in a community. Could be even an organization. How can I make my employees happier, or there are some studies. So I always want to connect the identification of this group of opinion to some line of actions as a leader or as a politician or whatever. But I can see the nuances of the human subjectivity. And this tool looks to me that helps me more, as you said, and I heard from other scholars, to identify a group of opinions that they do not emerge from traditional surveys and questionnaires, and I like that. And but I thank you for underlining the fact that you never get really, from your experience, really different opinions or solutions, better, that are opposite. So I thank you for this specification. And I can see on the chat box that there is a long
Oh, yeah.
question. I don't know if
That's
you
me. I
bring
was
it.
saying I could read it aloud if that's easier. I was
Yes.
just gathering my thoughts.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, shall I go ahead? There's no one else in the queue.
Sure.
Okay, I guess I was just going to say, so for me, actually the appealing part of Q in some regards was to dip my toes into the quantitative aspect of, because for me, subjectivity, qualitative research has been my bread and butter forever. I was almost sick of it. Like it's so natural to lean into those things and decipher multiple viewpoints and things like that. So both sides appeal, but you know, it was like, oh, what can I learn about this group thinking, and can I share percentages, but you know, also of course give rich qualitative data about them. So I guess I was curious if you would speak about using the subjectivities revealed by Q with the Q sort itself in relation to using it with other qualitative methods or having additional data. So both the after questions that come up, that sort of qualitative set of data that you have, but also like in my case, I did very long qualitative semi-structured interviews. So I have a lot more data with that than I do for what they actually penned out at the end of their Q sort, because they were exhausted. Because in my case, I interviewed them, they did a Q sort probably sometime later online. And then it was like, and why did you agree with that, right? So it's a lot. So I'm trying to think about how I will look at the Q sort and then also look at this additional qualitative data that informs that subjectivity even more so. So I use it all well, but I don't default to moving away from Q because it's new to me and just go back to my interviews solely as I'm so used to. If that makes sense. I don't know if that.
No, I gotcha. Yeah, I would say Q doesn't. I guess I'll put it. Q doesn't need help. It's its own complete methodology. But I think the ability to do really good structured interviews helps develop the concourse, and to link post-sort interviews with the people as they landed on the factors to inform you more about what their meaning was or what their takeaway or what they were trying to share. I think that there's nothing wrong with that, but I think they need the Q really is a complete methodology. So it's kind of like it's got all you need. I mean, it kind of goes back to the survey question about taking Q and mixing it with surveys. I am always back to the same question, which is why? Why would I do what else can I learn by then counting noses and figuring out how many, factor one people are in my school district? Does it matter? I don't know, but I know it doesn't matter to me. Like the problems that I'm investigating or trying to delve into, that doesn't help me. And so I guess my question would go back to you, Brittany, and say, what does it add? Does it add anything to your findings of the Q sort in the Q methodology aspect? Is there some other takeaway? I mean, and it might be the kind of thing where the real study is what you could find via Q, and then separately what you could find in those interviews and how the results differ. Because I think that would be a really informative paper. It would help more qualitative people see another avenue for studying subjectivity, just like the avenue that you've chosen to go down. I think that would be very meaningful.
Okay, that's interesting. That's helpful. I mean, right now I'm going to sort of isolate Q as one of my papers in a 3-article dissertation. But when you were saying that you don't care about, you care about what the factors reveal and the viewpoints, I was thinking, and I don't have this well articulated, but I was thinking, well, I definitely care about how many people or who they might be, and sort of digging into that perhaps in addition. I'm not sure how, but I mean, my research questions are different, and so it could be interesting to me for finding certain solutions in that regard. So but thank you for the answer.
Sure. All right.
I wonder if there is any other question, or if Dr. Ramlo already gave us a lot of time. I don't know if we don't want to take advantage of that, even if it's always nice to ask those scholars a lot of great questions.
And I want to encourage everybody 2 things. One, you should consider joining I4S, the International Society for the Scientific Study of Subjectivity. There is or will be a link on the Q website, qmethod.org, to join I4S. It's really cheap. And then you can think about going to our conference in 2023, which will be in Belfast, Ireland. And the other plug I'll give is that this group, although usually a much smaller selection of folks, we meet every Monday at 4 and talk about Q. So sometimes it's this kind of thing where we have a presenter, but more often than not, it's people bringing questions to the group and everybody basically having a Q community, right? Trying to help each other through questions related to Q methodology.
And I think just about everyone here has now signed up as a weekly Q attendee when they registered. So I'll be sending a special email with our it's a different link and just kind of some norms and things about how we run the group. So maybe we can continue the conversation next week, and then it's a little bit more casual. And yeah, I think Sue's one of our strongest attendees, and Rita and Seth, Renata, a couple regulars here, Joanna and Valerie. Yeah, so yeah, so we'll have more conversation next week. And I guess maybe Rita, Sue, I'll hand back to you for any closing remarks or things to share.
Thank you, first of all, to all the audience attend this great workshop, seminar with Dr. Ramlo today. I would be honored to be able to do this, but I want to thank above all Dr. Ramlo for her time, for her thoughts about this interesting, this great tool that is really changing, as I'm talking for me, changing my way to try to identify group of people having their opinions that are relevant to for us, as a community. I'm done. Dr. Ramlo, I don't know if you want to share last words, otherwise we can stop the recording and meet for those who want next Monday, for those who, for the weekly meeting, as Dr. Ramlo was say before.
Yes. And then on the 30th, Jim Rhodes is presenting his chapter. Hopefully he won't have a power outage again. So, but thanks everyone for attending, and I hope to see more of you in our weekly meetings and in Belfast. So,
You guys want to
thanks
unmute?
everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Rita, for facilitating. Thanks, Dr. Brown. Have a great day, all.
Thank you.